Good morning. Welcome to Christian Companions. For those of you who might have stumbled upon this, I say this every week, we are going through a curriculum because we are normally a 10:30 a.m. Sunday school class that meets here at the church for people 55 years or better. And for those of you who are not new and are normally here, welcome back. We're glad to have you. Today is October 11th, so I don't know what page it is in your book, but we are... Today is October 11th, so that's where you need to go in your books. You can also look for Luke 6, 27 through 36. We are talking about love for enemies, and you'll see why here shortly. I'm going to take a drink. Let's jump right in, though. So, Luke 6, 27 through 36. Let's just read it. Let's go. Luke 6, 27, 36. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have done to them. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. So, I'm really excited about this because we've been going through narratives, which is really hard to get deep on theologically because it's just mostly story. But this is teaching. This is theological and philosophical, and we can get into some things. So I'm excited. I'm not going to read the introduction because I'm going to be honest, it's really sad. I'm going to give you basically what's happening here. So in 2006, I don't know if you remember this, there was a shooting at a school in Pennsylvania that was an Amish school. 5 school-age girls were killed by this man. But the Amish community, not only after the funerals of their children, they paid for and started a fund for the shooter's family. One of the grandfather of the victim said, we must not think evil of this man, because they had this idea of exceptional grace, like grace beyond even comprehension. And so they paid for this person's funeral. Not only that, they made up more than half of the attendance at the funeral for the shooter himself. And they grieved with the widow and hugged her and loved on her. And it's just an example of exceptional love for enemies in the face of all sorts of things. And so that's a super great context for what Luke 6 is about here. Just that ultimate, unbelievable love for enemy, for those who are different or opposed to you even. So I will read the context though. Luke 6 contains an account of what has traditionally been called the Sermon on the Plain. Much attention has been given over the years to the relationship between the Sermon on the Plain and Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount. Some commentators have seen them as different versions of the same event. Others, perhaps most, have understood them to be independent of each other. This seems to be the best line of interpretation, and is the one we will follow here. The differences between the two sermons are readily apparent. One was delivered on a mountain, the other on a plain. The Sermon on the Plain is about 1/4 the length of the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes, which open the Sermon on the Mount, contain blessings only. The Sermon on the Plain opens with fewer blessings that are followed by a set of corresponding woes. A cursory comparison of Luke 6, 20 through 49 and Matthew 5 through 7 also shows how much these sermons have in common. Both sermons show great concern for the poor and socially outcast, teaching love for enemies, the centrality of mercy in the nature of the kingdom, opposition of hypocrisy, and so forth. That both of these sermons deal with these themes indicates just how commonly they appeared in Jesus' preaching and teaching ministry. Preaching and ministry. In Luke 6, the sermon comes on the heels of a controversy with the Pharisees, after which Jesus left to pray on a mountain. As on other occasions, deep prayer precedes a significant moment in Jesus' ministry. On this occasion, prayer preceded Jesus' choosing of the 12. After that, he came down to the plain. When Jesus opened his mouth to speak, looking at the disciples, he said, which in other words, it was the disciples, let me start that over. When Jesus opened his mouth to speak, this is what it says in Luke 6:20. Looking at his disciples, he said. So in other words, it was the disciples, those who were already committed in word and deed to follow the Lord, who were the primary audience for what he had to say. Others were present, the people, but they were hearing a message directed at Jesus' followers, not primarily at them. This is an important point to bear in mind as we undertake our study. Jesus was describing the nature of the kingdom in these verses. He painted a picture of the community that he was forming around him, of its way of life. These still are not words directed at outsiders or at the world at large. The Sermon on the Plain opens with a series of blessings and woes. They undercut the conventional view of the world that justify the way in which most of Jesus' hearers lived out their daily lives. Most people, both then and now, would point to the rich and powerful, the popular and elite, as successful and honored in this life. Jesus says this is not so. Rather, it is the poor and hungry, the bereft and the persecuted who are truly blessed. They can look forward to unimaginable blessing on the last day. Super long context, sorry, but it is good to know. I will say a couple things that one's worth saying, I think another might not be so much, and I'll start with that one. So there has been debate whether these are two different events, the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. I don't think it's a good conversation among Christians. It doesn't change the words in either of them at all. I personally am with the commentary here in that they're two separate events and that Jesus just said similar things in his life because he was the Son of God for 33 years. I'm sure he brought up blessings and woes on multiple occasions. But one of the really, I think, good arguments that this could be one event is geography. And that's why I think it's interesting, because I'm kind of boring sometimes. So we traditionally think of mountains as that, like mountain, like big steep peaks and goes up and down. Some of you have been to Israel, and so you might know this to be true, but sometimes their mounts are kind of hilly. We would, especially here in Kansas, we'd go, well, that's just an awfully big hill. And not only that, they're not so steep as they are slow builds to even sometimes a plateau and then just slow builds down. So they're not big swooping mountains. It's just kind of goes gradually up and gradually down. And so the argument is when it says he went up to the mountain to pray, and then on his way down he delivers this sermon on a flat area. Some argue that he went up this really slow incline, prayed on top of this kind of hill mountain thing, and then on the way down, this was such a gradual mountain, such a gradual, what's it called, descent, that was considered a plain also. And so that's one of the main arguments for why this is the same event, is because sometimes their mountains were just gradual, very gradual hills, to the point where you couldn't tell it was actually going up. That's probably only interesting to me, and I'm sorry if you're like this. I don't care what this is. I just think that's interesting. That's a fun argument for why these are two or one event, because it's kind of a hill. But that being said, I think it was two separate events, so that didn't matter at all. I just think it's interesting. The second thing is, I don't know if it's worth saying either. It's interesting the world we live in right now, because we live in I believe this might not be true. This is a philosophy I believe that has become, not pervasive, but everybody I think in some way believes in this. And you might even have seen this word often. A meritocracy, meaning that we are primarily governed by what we see as merit in other people. That idea of most people, both then and now, would point to the rich and powerful, the popular and elite, as successful and honored. That's the meritocracy. That's saying you have merit because you have power and wealth and ability and success and all these things. When I guess it's a meritocracy in view of what we think is merit today, right? So that I think is the issue with a lot of our church, well, not this specific church, but the church wide, is that we have this idea that we need to listen to the preachers who are writing books all the time and are preaching to tens of thousands of people because they have this popularity and this fame and this wealth that clearly they're being listened to because they have this worth and they have this because they are worthy of it, which is, it's just strange. It's ironic that we look to like the famous preachers when it's almost the opposite of what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Like, and it's just interesting. We need to flip what we consider merit, I guess, and flip it to what Jesus considers merit. Jesus considers merit to be those that are poor, and those that are hungry, and those that are struggling for him. So, again, I don't know if that was worth saying, but I just read an article about this morning. It's fresh in my mind, the idea of what meritocracy in our life today is. For more less interesting anecdotes on what a meritocracy is, feel free to call me or email me. But we'll move on to scripture, which is more important, and I'm going to erase this. All right. Let's jump in. Verse 27a, which we'll talk about that. But to you who are listening, I say, so the commentary, but I say, sets up the audience, whether hearing or reading, to discover a contrast. To you who are listening seems to be equivalent to meaning to that familiar phrase from the Gospels, whoever has ears, let them hear. The one who hears is not merely capable of making out audible sounds or speech. Rather, hearing requires understanding and, more critically, obedience to what is heard. It is about receptivity to the message, a willingness to transform one's life in accordance with the demands of the message. I think I've talked about this just about every week since we started back on video, the difference between hearing and listening. Jesus is saying, when Jesus says, whoever has ears, let them hear, or but to you who are listening, he's saying, I know you hear me, but are you listening? Meaning, you can't just hear the sounds. You have to hear the sounds and then equip them to your life and actually pursue what I've said with meaning. So they just keep repeating that theme in my mind. 27b, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. So the command that came out of Jesus' mouth was and still is counterintuitive. There is nothing else like it in all the texts that have come down to us from the ancient world. For instance, the poet Hesiod gives the typical understanding of one's obligations to his enemies. Love those who love you and help those who help you. Give to those who give to you, never to those who do not. It is not a part of unsanctified human nature to love enemies. The demand that Jesus makes in this verse is one that most of us will resist almost instinctively. It is a high standard and not natural for us, but it is surely attainable. The key lies in the perfection that Jesus calls for elsewhere. Perfection, except in reference to God, connotes not absolute unblemished sinlessness. Rather, perfection assumes a process of continual steady growth toward maturity. The believer who is growing, becomes increasingly able to extend love to enemies. Love is defined by action, do good, not sentiment or feeling. Love costs something, it does not come cheap. Yeah, that part was super important, especially that thing at the end. So love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. So in Greek, that love word is agape, which I'm sure you know what that is. There's basically five or six words for love in Greek, and agape is basically this unconditional love, like love no matter what. And so Christians, especially when I was growing up in the early 2000s, agape became this really kind of niche, popular thing. I wouldn't even say niche, maybe, what's the word I'm looking for? Kitsch? I don't know. But it became this really kind of trendy thing to talk about agape love, unconditional love. But it unfortunately got to be that way because agape love is really important to know in context of the Bible. Because what this is agape your enemies. Like, love your enemies unconditionally. Like, it doesn't matter what they do. You have to love them. This is a command. He's not saying, as long as they don't do X, Y, and Z, then you can stop loving them. No, it's love your enemies no matter what, unconditionally. And that can be you can misconstrue that without that qualifier of do good to those who hate you. Love is an action. Love is a verb. When I say I love you, it's a complete sentence. I, the subject, love, the verb, you, the predicate, the predicate. And so that's a full word because love is an action. It requires something. I can't just say I love my enemies and, just let my and just say I feel that. I feel love for my enemies. No, he's saying you have to go do something for your enemies. Like, that's the qualifier here. It's not feel love for your enemies. It's go and show love to your enemies. Whenever you see that word, whenever you see love in the Bible, it's always almost, I won't say always, nearly almost always means action. It doesn't mean this gushy, romantic, like I feel love for you. It's no, you go love them. You go and do something for them that shows them love. And so that's super important. And I would say we're really bad at this right now. This is a really divisive time to be living in. And it's really hard for everyone to say they have love for somebody and can go show it somewhere. One man's opinion. All right, 28. Bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. So this verse deals with love demonstrated in speech. These are examples that most likely would have come from the daily experiences of Jesus' hearers. Many of them were socially marginal or poor, thus already not commanding the respect of their peers. We can add to this picture the social pressures from family, friends, neighbors, and religious leaders that would have resulted from the decision to follow Jesus. It would have been easy and perfectly natural for the believers to return curses for curses or to otherwise retaliate for the abuse they suffered. Instead of this, Jesus called them and us to do the opposite, to bless those who curse them and to offer up prayers for those who took advantage of them. Yeah, this is still counter to the culture. Like, if somebody curses you, you retaliate. If somebody mistreats you, probably the church prays for them a little bit. Like, we as a group might pray for them, but I think most of the time when we are mistreated or we're hurt or anything, we often look to extend that hurt outward, right? We want to, if we're hurt, we want to hurt back. This is counter to what human beings want to do. And Jesus is saying you ought to do these things. And how amazing would the church look if we nailed just this one thing? Like, how quickly would people come to South Rock or just the church at large if we nailed this one thing of blessing those who curse us and praying for those who mistreat us? Whole of Derby in like a couple weeks, we did it. Oh, if only. All right, verse 29a. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to them the other also. So love is demonstrated in specific actions. Indeed, the love Jesus calls for is demonstrated by going beyond. The disciples of Jesus would offer the other also after being struck on the one cheek. Again, it is not all in our nature to take this kind of treatment. The desire for retaliation is exceedingly strong in these kinds of situations. Jesus' standards are not based on what people do naturally. Instead, they're based on God's own character and conduct. Jesus would demonstrate this truth in his last days. We need only consider his suffering and how easily he could have put an end to it to realize that Jesus modeled exactly what he preached. Yeah, the first few verses of this are all repeating kind of the same thing. When your enemies curse you, mistreat you, slap you in the face, and will get to take from you, it's all qualified under that first verse. You need to love them. You need to be good. You need to do good to them, even when they hate you. That's what you have been called to do. 29b and 30. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. So the commentary. Enemy love extends to our attitude toward our possessions as well. If the coat is required of a man, he should offer also his shirt. This goes well beyond the law, which would not allow the coat to be taken as surety for debt owed. Followers of Christ are not to be stingy with our things, because they are not ours to begin with. Moreover, we should trust God's provision enough to not expect to be repaid for what we give, much as Israel was called to trust him when they sacrificed the best of their flocks and fields. Jews in Jesus' time look forward to the day of deliverance that would come at the hands of a strong Messiah who would drive the Romans out of Judea. Indeed, the coming Messiah was frequently envisioned as a military leader. This desire can be seen in events like the Maccabean Revolt of 167 through 160 BC, when a leader, a hoped-for Messiah, would rebel against Rome and their chosen Jewish leaders in an attempt to free Judeans from their oppressors. In light of this, we can imagine that commands such as these would have rubbed many in the multitude the wrong way. Indeed, some of Jesus' closest followers, Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, for example, may have been disturbed by these words. We see that more clearly in other places in the Gospels, where Jesus' messianic self-understanding did not match up with the expectations that the crowd had for who the Messiah would be. Yeah. Okay, excuse me. So, first of all, something interesting. Coat versus shirt. So, I don't know if he said this, but basically the two Greek words here are describing. Oh, watch this. This is going to be impressive. I'm warning you. Gingerbread man. Okay, so let's think. Let's do that. Okay, this isn't as good as I thought it was going to be, but what are you going to do? There it is. Okay, so this purple area, I'm not going to lie to you, for an impromptu drawing of a man, that could have been worse. Okay, so this purple area here is the cloak. Is what the cloak is, what they're talking about here, or the coat, I guess they say in the NIV. Oh, can't really color with dry erase marker, I'll tell you. Okay, so the coat or the cloak was the outer garment, and the shirt was the inner garment. In the Greek, it's the literal wording, and they translated it here as shirt and coat, which in English helps us understand what that means because shirt goes closer and then a coat. But it's really cool that the Greek has this word as well. I'm saying. So the shirt was this white part and the cloak was the outer part. And in Matthew 5:40, on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew actually switches these. He says, if somebody sues you for your shirt, give them your cloak also. And here, Luke says, if somebody asks for your cloak, then give them your shirt. So they switch it. And this is a Jewish idea. So so it's actually kind of counter to what the commentary says. There's a tradition that you could give your, I'm trying to think, you could give your cloak. Oh man, I can't remember what it said for the life of me. Basically, Matthew was arguing from a Jewish perspective. If somebody is suing you for your shirt, then you need to give them your cloak also. Don't withhold that from them. And this was a Jewish idea of law and retribution, what you ought to do in the face of that. Luke isn't writing to a Jewish audience, and so I think that's why it gets changed here. Or maybe not even changed, but just gets written down differently. And there's this really interesting commentary I read where the suggestion of giving someone taking your coat, that verbiage of taking your coat from you, was actually and the context of where he's at delivering this message. The context of that is a robber stealing your coat. So you're walking through this plain, and a robber confronts you and at knife point demands your coat. You ought to give them your shirt as well. The shirt being the thing that's touching the shirt is the thing that's closest to your skin, basically, is what that Greek word means. And so he's saying, if somebody comes and steals your coat, give them your shirt also. And this commentary was great because he was basically saying what this is telling disciples, what this is telling Christians, is that if you're in the face of something that is like a robbery, something that has intentions of evil, you have that opportunity to make it into a charitable good. So he is taking your coat from you, which is an act of evil. He is holding you up for your coat, but you can turn this situation into a good situation by your generosity and charity. Take off your shirt and give it to them also, and make it not an act of evil, but make it an act of good, which is, again, thinking in context of how Jesus is saying this is a good way to look at how he's trying to explain it to his disciples, but also is just counter to how we act and how we behave and who we are as people even today. It's wild. And then to give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. So, yeah, just that, again, that idea of giving to, like, if someone asks, just give more and don't expect anything back is just so counter. And we get into kind of that here in a second. But that plays into something that is a law. Basically, Jewish people weren't allowed to charge interest to other Jews in the land. So, like, you couldn't charge interest if you gave money, which was immediately forgotten about, and that law was broken immediately. But it does go to question if we ought to as well. But kind of what he said at the beginning, I'm getting into it. There's a whole philosophical thing of this, but if you give money to a Christian, ought you expect interest back? Probably not. Anyway, we'll keep moving, because I'm going to get caught up in the air on a lot of things. I'm going to erase my little gingerbread man, though. Okay. 31. Do to others as you would have them do to you. So Jesus turned to a new line of discussion. Whereas Luke 6:27-30 describes a specific behavior that characterizes the kingdom Jesus had come to establish, verses 31-36 speak to the motives for those behaviors. It is noteworthy here that we are no longer strictly focused on treatment of one's enemies, but on people in general. The focus of Jesus' words had broadened to include everyone with whom the believer interacts. This verse is Jesus' statement of what we commonly call the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule is an expansion of Leviticus 19:18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Compared to Matthew 7:12. Several versions of this principle can be found in ancient literature. Philo of Alexandria, a Greek-speaking Jewish philosopher, said, "No one shall do to his neighbor what he would be unwilling to have done to himself." Seneca the Younger, a Roman philosopher, similarly wrote, "Let us give in the manner that would have been acceptable if we were receiving." These examples from both Jewish and Roman backgrounds show that at least some philosophers assumed a stance of reciprocal good that is expanded on in Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Plain. Reciprocal good, that's something you should remember, because we'll get into that here in a second, actually. Yeah, let's get into that here. 32, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. So sinners here simply refers to all those who operate on normal human terms with regard to personal relationships, exchange, and so forth. Everyone who does not conform their lives to the standards of the new kingdom that Jesus proclaimed lives this way. They love those who love them, no more and no less. Jesus called on his disciples to go beyond this limited and limiting standard. They were to give and to do good without expectation of return or reward of any kind. This is the higher standard. Righteousness that surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, Matthew 5:20, that Jesus explicitly called for. And that's where I'll cut in. And it kind of gets into this. So in this time, giving gifts was something you only did for status. Isn't that interesting? So because this was a very honor-shame system. And I know I've mentioned that in our Wednesday class, but that's been like forever ago. And I've probably mentioned it in here a few times. But basically, you have this kind of scale of honor and shame. And it was similar to, it's this thing where if you had money and power and prestige, and you were able to tell a joke, and you were able to debate and be fun and hold your wine and all these different things, you would kind of earn honor. And so you could be kind of high society. You know, it was, I think of like oh, The Great Gatsby. Like, Gatsby was kind of up here. He had all this wealth and intrigue, and he was interesting, and he threw interesting parties, and the girls loved him, and the men wanted to be him, and all this stuff. And Jay, who's or no, that's Jay Gatsby. The narrator of the story. I am struggling today. The narrator of the story was kind of down here. He was just a guy that worked in the city, and he lived next to Gatsby, and he just got to go to his parties, but he saw Gatsby as this honor and this thing and this, wow, he has money and wealth, and we do that all the time today. I mean, there's people that are like, oh man, look at Jeff Bezos. He has billions of dollars. That's amazing. We do that with all sorts of things. I mean, I'm trying to think of other rich people, but I'm just struggling a little bit. I don't know why. My tongue is moving faster than my mind is, which isn't a good place to be. But they had this honor-shame system. And so what they would do is if you were, like, let's say you were here, and you wanted to gain honor, or you wanted to gain leverage or power over someone, you would give, like this, you would give somebody over here a gift, and if they weren't able to reciprocate, again, that idea that I told you to remember, reciprocal good, if they weren't able to reciprocate the gift you gave them on an equal or better footing, that would make you go up, they would go down, and you would have power over them. You would be able to say, well, I clearly have more influence and honor because you can't afford to give it. And so it was constantly that. And so up here, it was almost like it was like playing chicken with gifts. You would give in order to be given back to. That was the only point. The whole point of giving a gift was to receive something in return. And it was just to go up and down this shame honor scale. To be, and the more honored you were, the higher in society you became. And so that's kind of what he's getting into here. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? If you give, if you love, expecting love in return, what good is that? If you love because you know you are loved by this person, what good is that? What credit comes from that? And then one thing I'll say, because we'll get into that a lot, the word credit here is charis, or charis, depending on how you want to pronounce it in Greek. But it's normally, like anywhere else, almost exclusively, is translated grace. Think about that. So grace is, think about what grace is. Grace is receiving something that is not expected of you, right? Receiving something that you're not expecting in the face of kind of your shortcomings, right? You're receiving grace because of something you've done or a shortcoming you have or a problem. And so he's saying here, if you love someone who loves you, what credit is that? What grace do you have there? Because you're not giving of yourself to someone who is in need. You're giving to someone who already has. So where's your grace really going here? It's really interesting, and we'll get into that more kind of. And you'll see why that is interesting as it plays out. 33 though. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. Excuse me. Got a piece of ice. Man, struggling. All right. This verse presents the same question as Luke 6:32 with slightly different phrasing. Jesus envisioned the end of merely prepaying good for good. Our behavior in this new reality that Jesus preached is not to be predetermined by our sense of what we are owed or what we owe. Good should be shown to others for its own sake, not for the sake of anything that we might receive in return. Yeah, don't give good to an expectation of getting good back. You give a gift so you can have something over someone, or you give a gift to be honored among peers. Jesus is totally changing that up. He's saying, no. You don't give good expecting good back. You give good just to give good. He's saying everybody in the world loves those who love them. That doesn't make you different. That's not counter to the culture. You need to give good for the sake of just giving good. Okay, 34. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. So the observant reader will have noticed that Luke 6:32 through 34 constitutes a three-part question. All three make the same basic point. The way of life expounded by Jesus makes demands on those who would follow him, demands that fall outside the boundaries, of normal human relationships and cultural expectations. Roman society was based on the fulfillment of obligations between patrons and clients, between the elites and the masses. Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Plain cut to the heart of that arrangement and undermine it. The kingdom of God is marked by a new approach to human relationships that explodes our ideas about status, possessions, what we believe we are entitled to, and many other subjects. What is our attitude toward lending our possessions or resources? This is arguably one of the touchiest aspects of interpersonal relationships. How many friendships have ended over the loaning of money or other possessions? This is to say nothing of relationships that are not nearly as close to begin with. Yeah, I mean, how many times have you, I won't get into that, but it's the idea of just, if you give something to someone, you ought not, if you give something of yourself to someone, you ought not expect something in return, because that will be credited to you. I mean, I can think of so many times that somebody has given me something, including money, and told me, exclusively said, I expect nothing from this. Like, I am giving you this as a gift. How blessed that made me feel. And they are blessed for it, having been made the less. So do that more. But this goes into the whole idea of what I kind of talked about at the beginning, which makes it worth it, by the way. A meritocracy. I have merit because I gave you something. You have less merit because you weren't able to give to me. This is a strict meritocracy of wealth, possession, honor, shame, and so on. All right, 35a. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. So verse 35 is a kind of summary statement for this entire passage, a concise repetition of its main themes. Again, the emphasis is on action. It is tempting for us to agree with Jesus that genuine Christian love does not seek any benefit beyond the opportunity to act in love. We could nod our heads in affirmation and then turn to the next verse. But if we stop and think about how Jesus repeated this idea, and if we reflect also on the fact that love is the dominant ethic in the New Testament, then perhaps we ought to pause to investigate our own intentions carefully. In all honesty, are we able to act in a way that is self-sacrificing? Can we act in the interests of others with no expectation of anything in return? Can we act with no expectation of thank you cards or pats on the back? Those are good questions to think about. I'll let you think about them on your own. So 35b, then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. Commentary. As John the Baptist implies in Luke 3:8 through 9, to be the child of someone or something is to share in the character of that person or object. That's also just true in general. To be children of the Most High, Jesus' hearers and we are called to do the same things that God does, especially loving our enemies. These motives also become benefits to us when we demonstrate the kind of love that Jesus had in mind. Jesus was clearly stressing that the ability to love others in a self-sacrificial manner is an important component of our eternal reward. This kind of love is a vital part of our identity as the children of the Most High. Thus, Jesus' sermon presents the idea that the motivation for living a certain kind of life is not based on what we can get out of it in the here and now. Even so, isn't the motivation of an eternal reward at least somewhat selfish in and of itself? Whew, isn't that a question? Basically, is your motivation just to get to heaven? Man, that might be a question for the ages, huh? That's a good question, but also thinking, how many people think of Christianity as a meritocracy? How many people in our church think, if I do enough good, I can climb the ladder and get the reward? How many people, whoo, boy, here we go, we're doing it now. We have made it. How many Christians think that Christianity is a meritocracy? where if I do something good, I can climb the ladder to heaven, as opposed to doing good for the sake of good and for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. How many of you can say you've done that? How many Samuels can say they've done that? Very little. Yeah, isn't that interesting though? What credit is it to us? What reward will we receive if we're just trying to climb the ladder to get to heaven? Probably not much. The reward is when we give and love and do for nothing in return. And man, think about that reality. Like, we're not doing these things. We ought not do good. We ought not do the things that we're doing or we're called to just to get to heaven. We ought to do them because we realize that the grace of God has extended even to us, the sinner, so that we can extend it further beyond us. We're not doing this to get to heaven. We're doing this because we want people to know what the cross of Christ has done in our lives. Whoo! Isn't that good? That's hard. That's a hard truth, and it's hard for even this preacher to gather that. Christianity is not a meritocracy. It's not based on merit. It's based on the grace of God dying on the cross for us and defeating death. And so it's not our job to climb the ladder to heaven. It's our job to make sure as many people can get on the ladder, and then hopefully, and then hope, and I mean hope as in trust, that God's grace will be good enough that even if we're here at the end of life, God's grace will see us through to the top. Blowing up. All right. Verse 35c. Because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. God's character is to be kind, even to people who are ungrateful and wicked. His character is our ultimate example. Our desire to please him is our ultimate motivation. Oh, I just said that. Jesus introduced this point so that we can understand that the way we're being called to live is not arbitrary. Rather, it is the life that imitates our Heavenly Father. So here we have the motivation for achieving the objectives Jesus laid out for us throughout his sermon. Yeah, if I had inclination and time and thought process, I'd want to parse this verse a little bit because it's interesting. The verse itself says this: "Then your reward will be great, and you'll be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked." Who are the ungrateful and the wicked? Are the ungrateful and the wicked the people that we are giving good to and aren't getting repaid for? Because if that's the case, then why is God being kind to them and not to us who are giving good? You see what I'm saying? So is this calling us ungrateful and wicked because we're giving with unclean hearts? You see what I'm saying? It's a little confusing of the verbiage, but I think you could argue that. You could argue either point. You can look into it and parse it. For now, what I'm going to say is let's just praise God that he is kind to those who are ungrateful and wicked. The ESV says selfish and ungrateful and selfish. So let's just praise God that he's gracious. Finally, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. So a way of summarizing Jesus' point in verse 35 is to say that God is merciful. His action toward us are gracious and ultimately intended for our redemption. The primacy of mercy in the character of God likewise points us to a new way of life. Be merciful. In which the critical value is not reciprocity, but behavior imitative of our merciful Father, which again is kind of what I've just been going through over here. Excuse me, dry throat. Yeah. But again, it's this idea of be merciful just as the Father is merciful. It's very similar to be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect, because you're thinking, I have to be as perfect as God. How is that possible? Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Well, our Father in heaven expunged the sins of the entire human race from beginning to end. That's how merciful we need to be. So merciful that we will forgive a multitude of sins, including all the sins. Like, that's how merciful we are called to be in this verse. Ooh, yeesh, that's rough. Good luck with that this week, because I'm not there yet. I'm just kidding. I'm going to work on it. Yeah, but what a tough calling. I loved this section. I'm so glad they got to Luke, got to some non-narrative stuff because, again, narrative is just hard to teach. And then we got to talk about meritocracy, charis, and the social scale, and heaven and hell. So look at that. That is all we have. That's all I have for today. Questions, comments, and concerns, bold, salacious attempts to tell me I'm wrong, email me, samuelo@southrockchristian.com. Call me, 788-5503. That's the church's number, 788-5503. We should come up with a catchy jingle, commercial jingle. As always, I miss you guys in this class. I wish you were here, and we would probably spend hours talking about what a meritocracy is in this class, knowing you all that watch this normally. So maybe someday soon we can get in here and talk meritocracy. Anyway, love you all, miss you all, and hopefully I'll talk to you soon. So until next time.